I'm Russell, and this is Voice-Over Work, an audiobook sampler. Where do you listen? Today is January 29th, 2023. Today's episode is the chapter-by-chapter preview of Self-Reliance in the 21st Century by Charles Hugh Smith. In this book, and in previous works by Mr. Smith, he contends that just as no one was left unaffected by the rise of globalization, no one will be unaffected by its demise. Not to be confused with self-supporting, which is making enough money to support yourself, and self-sufficiency, think of Thoreau's cabin on Walden Pond. Self-reliance isn't about piling up money or living in a cabin in the woods. It's about humanity's most successful innovation cooperating with trustworthy others in productive networks. Chapter 1. Self-Reliance, Then and Now. The difference between self-reliance in 1841 and the 21st century. What is self-reliance? Ralph Waldo Emerson's advice in his 1841 essay, Self-Reliance, still rings true today. Be yourself. No base imitator of another, but your best self. There is something which you can do better than another. For Emerson, self-reliance means thinking independently, trusting your own intuition, and refusing to take the well-worn path of conforming to others' expectations. This celebration of individualism is the norm today, but it was radical in Emerson's more traditionalist day. What's striking about Emerson's description of self-reliance is its internal quality. It's about one's intellectual and emotional self-reliance, not the hands-on skills of producing life's essentials. Emerson doesn't describe self-reliance in terms of taking care of oneself in practical terms, such as being able to build a cabin on Walden Pond and live off foraging and a garden like his friend Thoreau. The land on Walden Pond was owned by Emerson. Emerson did not address practical self-reliance because these skills were commonplace in the largely agrarian, rural 1840s. Even city dwellers mostly made their living from practical skills, and the majority of their food came from nearby farms. Imported sugar, coffee, tea, and spices were luxuries. The economy of the 1840s was what we would now call localized. Most of the goods and services were locally produced, and households provided many of their own basic needs. Global trade in commodities, such as tea and porcelain, thrived, but these luxuries made up a small part of the economy, one exception being whale oil used for lighting. Even in the 1840s, few individuals were as self-sufficient as Thoreau. Households met many of their needs themselves, but they relied on trusted personal networks of makers and suppliers for whatever goods and services they could not provide themselves. Households sold their surplus production of homemade goods, and family businesses offered small-scale production of specialty goods, metal forging, furniture, etc., and services, printing, legal documents, etc. For example, Thoreau's family business was manufacturing pencils and supplying graphite, pencil lead. Before he took over this business on the death of his father, he earned his living as a surveyor. Households obtained what they needed from local networks of suppliers who were known to them. If some item was needed from afar, the local source had their own network of trusted suppliers. The government's role was also limited. The government provided postal, judicial, and basic education systems and collected tariffs on trade, but its role in everyday life beyond these essential services was modest. The conditions of Emerson and Thoreau's day, localized, hands-on self-reliance was the norm, and the elevation of the individual as radical have reversed. Now, The celebration of the individual is the norm, while few have practical skills. Chapter 2, The Mindset of Self-Reliance. The goal of self-reliance. The goal of self-reliance is to improve well-being, security, and productivity by optimizing practical skills, flexibility, trusted personal networks, and what author Nassim Taleb termed anti-fragility. Not just surviving adversity, but emerging stronger. The purpose of increasing self-reliance is to navigate the unprecedented transition from excess consumption to securing essentials. This goal demands we avoid becoming attached to anything other than self-reliance. Embrace evolutionary churn and transparency. Self-reliance is served by understanding everything is a system, not just nature's ecosystems, but human organizations too. When the fundamentals of life change, every ecosystem must evolve or die. This is equally true of human organizations, from households to nations. When conditions change, this applies selective pressure to the system, incentivizing adaptations that work better in the new conditions. Evolution conserves what works while experimenting with mutations to find advantageous adaptations. Nature and human systems evolve via natural selection, the process of responding to evolutionary pressures by experimenting with variations and then selecting those that are the most advantageous. In genetics and epigenetics, this process is automatic. In human organizations, those in power influence the choice of what is conserved or replaced. Those benefiting from the system try to conserve it as is, while those weakened by selective pressure support trying something new. Those in power have few incentives to risk changing the system, as this could undermine their power. From their perspective, evolutionary forces threaten the status quo that benefits them. Evolution requires transparency and variability. Evolution is only possible if the system generates a steady stream of mutations, variations. Variations are the fuel of evolution. If there are no variations, there's nothing new which might offer selective advantages. Transparency is the mechanism needed to test variability to discover if it offers advantages. In human organizations, transparency means there's a free-for-all churn of ideas, dissent, experimentation, and sharing of results. New ideas and data flow freely between all the nodes of the system. This free-flowing dynamic mixing is evolutionary churn. Without evolutionary churn, systems cannot adapt. Inflexible and brittle, they break apart as all the things that no longer work chip away at the system's stability, i.e., its capacity to keep functioning. Human organizations that lack variability and transparency fail to evolve because they lack the means to do so. This is scale invariant, meaning it's true from the smallest scale to the largest scale. Relationships, enterprises, and nations lacking variability and transparency all fail for the same reasons. Transparency is not easy. People contest our treasured orthodoxies, and we're forced to admit to being wrong more often than we like. It hurts our pride, and we lose. Chapter 3, The Nuts and Bolts of Self-Reliance. Here's my list of the nuts and bolts of self-reliance. They are distilled from my experience. I am average in self-reliance, aptitudes, and skills. I present this list not as someone on the peak looking down, but as someone on the trail looking up. Self-reliance is a work in progress, not a destination. These are guidelines that have helped me, but everyone has to chart their own course. As Emerson explained, the essence of self-reliance is that each individual makes their own assessments, decisions, and plans based on their unique circumstances. These are general principles. My hope is that some will be useful to you. 1. Get healthy and stay healthy. 2. Cultivate the inner strengths described by Emerson. To think independently and not be swayed by conformity or the opinions of others. Rely on ourselves. Trust our intuition and take action. Do the thing, and you shall have the power. 3. Cooperation and reciprocity. Becoming a productive participant in a trusted network of people producing and procuring essentials. 4. Focus on producing and sharing rather than taking. 5. Finding solutions for ourselves and our households rather than relying on authorities. 6. Need less, consume less, waste nothing. Become resourceful. 7. Reduce dependency on fragile supply chains and energy-intensive systems. 8. Be flexible. Thomas Z. Zhang's translation of Chapter 76 of the Tao Te Ching offers a succinct summary. Rigidity leads to death. Flexibility results in survival. My old philosophy professor, Chang Chung-yuan, translated the following line as, "Thus, when troops are inflexible, they lose the war." 9. Pursue projects that can be completed with the resources we have on hand. As Sun Tzu put it, if a battle cannot be won, do not fight it. 10. Be willing to move to places with fewer institutional rigidities, fewer dependencies on global supply chains, and more local sources of essentials. 11. Develop practical, experiential skills to produce basic goods and services. 12. Accumulate all forms of capital, tangible and intangible. These are the foundations of self-reliance. 13. Develop self-knowledge of our strengths and constraints, and the ability to be realistic in assessments and decisions. 14. Develop a working knowledge of systems. We live within systems, and our life can best be understood as a system. 15. Become anti-fragile, which means navigating adversity and emerging with greater strength and adaptability. If you enjoyed this episode of VoiceOver Work, an audiobook sampler, we'd love for you to rate or review this episode on whatever platform you found it. Join us again next week for the preview of another audiobook.